A very good afternoon, very good morning, and for some of you, it could be an evening. Welcome to this session today. And my name is Kadirasan K, and I'm the founder and the managing director of the Center for Mindfulness. And I'm very pleased to be here today in conjunction with the World Mental Health Day as well, to talk about mindfulness-based culture for organizational well-being. Now, before I proceed on, I would like to acknowledge my gratitude and thanks to PRCA Southeast Asia for hosting this talk. I believe many of you may be very curious with the term mindfulness-based culture. And perhaps organizational well-being is something that is perhaps very popular and already known to many of you. But what is mindfulness-based culture? Now, you may not find this term perhaps when you Google it, but this is something very interesting and something that me and my colleagues have been working with many organizations in this region to see how we could bring the insights and the outcomes of mindfulness and bring that into a space where we can enhance culture in organizations, primarily from a well-being perspective. And I'm going to talk more about that. Mindfulness-based culture can also be interpreted as mindfulness-informed culture, meaning that a culture in an organization can be radically and profoundly influenced by mindfulness and the insights that we gain from the practice. And I'm going to talk more about that right now. I will be devoting about 35 minutes to about 45 minutes on the content that I prepared for every one of you in the room. And after which I will take questions via the Q&A chat window. All right, so that's the plan for today. And before we get into the subject matter, I would like to invite all of you to perhaps just sit silently for a couple of seconds. And if you feel comfortable, and if it works for you, may I invite you to close your eyes. And then bringing your attention to your breathing. Bringing a gentle curiosity to each in-breath and out-breath. And then gently noticing what your intentions are in this present moment. Perhaps, why am I here? Recognizing my intentions. Without judgment. And then gently bringing your attention back to your breathing. And when you are ready, gently open your eyes. Now, with that, let us now explore the topic at hand. Now, as a human civilization, there were many beliefs that we had revised or even disbelieved after some time in light of evidence. And there are many beliefs that we had and we cherished. And I'm going to share with you a couple of them that we used to acknowledge as even facts. Now, until 1543, the earth was believed to be the center of the universe. Can you believe that? That was what we thought. And then until 1974, people thought that different parts of our tongue picked up different tastes. In fact, I did not know this until the 90s, right? Because I used to believe that, yes, different part of the tongue actually had picked up different tastes. Now, did you know that jogging did not become popular until the 1960s? Now, some of you may be very surprised by this. Every time I share this, people usually get very surprised. They did not know that actually people did not jog as much prior to the 1960s. Can you believe that? It was made popular by a particular person in the 1960s, and then jogging became popular. And did you know that until the 1970s, we believed that the brain's structure was fixed and it cannot be altered or it doesn't change? And that's what we thought. But since 1970s, we know that the human brain actually changes, and it can keep changing even through adulthood, even right now in our 40s, 50s, 60s, it can still change. That's what we see. So what does this tell us? Why am I sharing these pieces of information with you? Now, the reason for this is that as part of our human civilization and history, there were many beliefs that we had that got revised or even dumped. Because in light of evidence, we saw that there were greater things that we could possibly do with the evidence that we have. And therefore, we revised all of our beliefs. Now, mindfulness too is something that can actually help us look at ourselves in a very different way. And that is what evidence is now showing us. And that's the reason why I believe every one of you is here today. Now let's talk about mindfulness, because today mindfulness is a big buzzword. And when you Google mindfulness, you get thousands of hits. And you may see different versions of mindfulness. And people tend to also sometimes present mindfulness as a fad. Sometimes it's possible because we're not looking at the evidence base of mindfulness. But yet, mindfulness in the recent decade has enjoyed a tremendous boost of evidence, as you can see from this particular graph that I'm sharing in the screen right now. Now, as you can see, in the last 10 years, since 2010 till this particular year on the graph that you see till 2019, now you've seen an exponential increase in the number of journal articles published. Now, these are journal articles published. But if you were to take into account the research experiments that are being conducted across the globe, now it would be probably threefold or fourfold. So all of these evidences that you see from these journal articles tend to tell us something very interesting about the human being. I use the word human being very deliberately because we are discovering more and more about the way our minds work and the way our brains work, or even everything else, the whole organism that we have. And this is a very important discussion when it comes to organizational well-being, because one of the biggest gap that we see in organizational development discussions is the absence of psychology, the absence of understanding biology. So this psychophysiological discussion is something that is absent when it comes to business discourses. And myself, having worked in the space of organizational development as well, and leadership development, culture transformation, this is something that I recognize, a big gap when it comes to looking at organization as a whole, but keeping the psychological aspects apart. I'm talking about well-being particularly, because there is a connection with performance, which we'll talk about in a while. So looking at this evidence base that you see for mindfulness, now we can learn a lot about how we can bring those insights into organizational well-being, and possibly how can we even achieve that through mindfulness, which I'm going to talk about a couple of ideas in a while. So the question now may be, what is mindfulness? Some of you may be very curious. Some of you may be already aware of what mindfulness is. So I'm sharing with you the classical definition of mindfulness given by the founder of the secular mindfulness movement, Dr. Jon Kabat-Zinn. Now, Kabat-Zinn has been responsible for starting the movement of secular mindfulness or evidence-based mindfulness, which is quite different from the religious or the spiritual streams of mindfulness. So this is a secular one that is perhaps relevant for everyone. So this is the classical definition, which means paying attention in a particular way, on purpose, in the present moment, and non-judgmentally. So I have highlighted 4 important terms in this definition: paying attention, on purpose, present moment, and non-judgmentally. Now, this practice definition that you see right now in front of you differentiates mindfulness from other types of meditation practices. So some of us may tend to use the word mindfulness as a synonym for meditation. All right. So some of us think that practicing mindfulness is the same as practicing meditation. So let me tell you something very interesting. While mindfulness is a type of meditation, but not all meditation techniques are mindfulness practices. Allow me to repeat this. While mindfulness is a type of meditation, but not all meditation techniques are actually mindfulness practices. So therefore, mindfulness is a very unique type of meditation for many reasons, which I'm not going to dwell into deeply in this session, because that is not the purpose of this session. I believe you can get that information probably by Googling it or even doing more research on your own. So let's look at how mindfulness is practiced. So I'm going to now illustrate this for all of you. Now take a look at this image in the on the slide. So you can see right on the left of this slide deck, you can see that there is actually a glass of water. Now, if you're looking at this image right now, which I would like to invite all of you to do that, now you are paying attention, right? That's the first, perhaps, criterion for the definition of mindfulness. So now you're paying attention to this image in front of you. Now, if you are doing this purposefully, meaning that your mind is connected to your pair of eyes and you are looking at this image, then you're doing this purposefully. All right, so you're doing it purposefully, meaning you know why you're doing it and you're doing it intentionally. That's the second criterion. The third one is this, which is the present moment. So what does this mean? If this image reminds you that you have a similar glass at home, that would mean that your mind has gone to the past. Now, if this image tells you that you are thirsty right now, you need to go and grab a glass of water, the mind has gone to the future. If you're just looking at this image as it is right now, that means you are in the present moment. So in mindfulness practices, we notice the present moment. While we acknowledge that the mind could go to the past or go to the future, but we gently and compassionately bring the mind back to the present moment. Now, take a look at this image. Continue to look at this image. Now, is this glass half empty or half full? So some of us may claim that it is half empty. Some of us may claim that it is half full. So from a mindfulness perspective, both are judgments. This glass of water is just a glass of water. So sometimes it is not about being optimistic or being pessimistic, because in mindfulness practices, we notice things as they are, or we notice our breath, we notice our sensations, our thoughts as it is in the present moment. So this actually satisfies the fourth criterion, which is non-judgment. So in every authentic mindfulness practice, we would have these 4 conditions satisfied: paying attention purposefully in the present moment, non-judgmentally. So this is the uniqueness of mindfulness meditation. So you may be now curious to know what happens to us when we continue to practice mindfulness over a length of time. Let's look at that, because that's very important, because we need to look at the evidence base of practitioners who have done this over a length of time. So I'm showing you an excerpt from a 2015 research. So researchers have found that when people practice mindfulness over a considerable time, several parts of the brain get impacted. As you can see, it's highlighted. All right, the lateral view and the medial view. Lateral view means from the side, and the medial view means, just imagine if the brain is seen right from the right, if the brain is cut into half and you see from inside. All right, that's what it is. So we can see that there are many parts of the brain that are impacted by mindfulness practices. Now, this is one great gift that we can enjoy right now in this part of human history, because we can now put people in MRI machines to look at what happens to a practitioner of mindfulness. So we have that opportunity right now, and we can look at it as a brain phenomenon as well. Now, this is what you see, the impact that it has. I would like to focus on two important parts of the brain. Here, of course, you can see three on this image, but I would like to focus on two, which is the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. Now, the prefrontal cortex of our brain is responsible for the executive functions, meaning that that's the part of the brain that allows us to rationalize, make decisions, yes, no, right, wrong. Such evaluations are done from that space. Now, the amygdala works in a different fashion. The amygdala is very much influenced by emotions, number one. Number two, is also prone to what we call as the reactive functions of fight, flight, and freeze. Some of you may have heard of these three Fs. Now, so when the amygdala is overactive, what happens is the fight, flight, and freeze reactions tend to overpower or dominate our behavior. So imagine if in every workplace conflict, perhaps, all right, in a workplace you have a conflict. Now imagine if you fought every conflict, or if you tend to avoid, which is to flee, to take flight during every conflict that you encounter, or you totally freeze, you say nothing. Now, would that advance the goals of the organization? Now, it's a good question to think about. So with the people that I work with, I ask them to think about this. What is the cost? I use the word cost very deliberately here. There is a cost for actually avoiding a conflict, maybe fighting or trying to dominate a conflict, trying to get our way, or even not responding. There is a cost, something to be lost. Now, if we could shift our response to the seat of the prefrontal cortex, which would then allow us to respond even in times of conflict. Now, what is the value of doing that in organizations? Now, this simple question that I've just asked could actually allow you to see the value that mindfulness could bring in workplaces, in organizations, as well as well-being. I hope you can recognize that. So what research tells us is, with mindfulness practice, the amygdala becomes underactive. Now, instead of being overactive, that means the amygdala becomes now less active. Not that it's not active, because we do need the amygdala in emergency situations. All right, it gets less active. And the prefrontal cortex, the front part of our brain, it becomes more active. Now, that's what we see from research findings. And also people who we have worked with, we have trained thousands of people, and people, interestingly, people do give us feedback. They say that, you know what, I'm able to respond more than before. So some of these benefits are also recorded in this slide. As you can see, responding instead of reacting, improved mental health, and obviously why we are having this session right now, because it is in conjunction with the World Mental Health Day as well. It helps us to improve our mental health, stress reduction, emotional regulation, increases positive states of mind, and etc. Now, I would like to also direct your attention to the 8th point, which is to enhance attention and resilience in high stress professions. So this is very important in today's workplace, especially right now, where we are in unprecedented times, and this can really help people to actually be more resilient. And there is a couple of misconceptions about mindfulness. The first one is people tend to assume that mindfulness is the same as meditation. It's not true, because the image of meditation that we have is a person who sits cross-legged, eyes closed. Now, that's the idea of meditation that we usually harbor in our minds, because that's the kind of memory that we have. But mindfulness can be practiced very, very in different ways, rather. There is mindful walking. There is also mindful eating. There is mindful movements, where you move different parts of your limbs and you bring your attention to it. So therefore, it is a misconception to think
that mindfulness is entirely the same as meditation. Number two, mindfulness is for relaxation. Now, this is another big misconception that people have, because people tend to think that mindfulness is for the purpose of relaxation. That is also not true. Now, because, let me tell you why, because there are a dozen ways that you could actually become relaxed. You can spend your time with your loved ones, you could possibly feel relaxed. Or you could go for a walk in the park, you could possibly feel relaxed, or listen to music, watching movies, all of them can make you feel relaxed. Then why would you need mindfulness then, right? Can you see that? However, relaxation is one of the secondary outcomes of mindfulness practice, not the primary, all right, secondary. So definitely it is helpful, but that's not the reason why perhaps we should practice mindfulness. Now, some people think mindfulness is clearing thoughts or emptying your mind. No, it is not true. In mindfulness, we become comfortable with our thoughts. We've got no issues with whatever thoughts that arise in our mind. We learn to create a very healthy relationship and a positive relationship with our thoughts. And lastly, people tend to think that mindfulness is spiritual or religious. So I need to share something very important at this juncture. Now, there are spiritual and religious streams of mindfulness, all right? There are. And there are also secular streams of mindfulness. So there are two streams. So whenever you encounter the word mindfulness, it is important to find out whether it has any spiritual or religious undertones. Sometimes they are not overt. They could be undertones because, to be very honest, sometimes mindfulness teachers may not be even aware of the spiritual or religious ideas that are there implicitly in mindfulness practices. However, what I'm sharing with you today is about secular mindfulness, which has got almost nothing to do with spirituality or religiosity in that sense. So with that, now that we have examined what mindfulness is and its benefits and how it works very briefly, let's look at the second topic, which is organizational well-being. Now, organizational well-being is a very huge topic. In fact, there is no one single theory that we all agree with, or even scholars and academics agree with regard to what it is. However, I'm going to share with you or propose to you two models that could be very helpful in trying to frame organizational well-being. Now, the first one is something called positive organizational scholarship. Now, this particular model, as you can see here, which was created by Kim Cameron, Professor Kim Cameron. If I'm not wrong, he's from the University of Michigan at that time when this theory was developed, and a lot of evidence that was found that when these four elements that you see on the screen, positive climate, positive relationships, positive communication, positive meaning. Now, when they come together in organizations through obviously leadership behavior, now people's well-being gets enhanced. And not only that, they also found that the organizations performed better with this model approach, as you can see. Now, this is a very interesting thing because usually when we talk about organizational well-being, people tend to think about wellness. Now, when the word wellness is used, there is this misconception that wellness is pertaining to just the person or the employees in an organization. But that is not the case. We need to recognize that when we talk about organizational well-being, it also includes your profitability. It also includes your sustainability initiatives as well, or even sustainable profits. So when we look at organizational well-being, now we need to look at it holistically in that sense. There is also another model, which is this one. Here you can see the evolution in the way that we have looked at competitive advantage. Now, right from the left, you can see the traditional economic capital, where we look at everything in terms of finances, right? How much do we make? Now, that becomes the sole criterion through which we evaluate. And then we slowly moved into human capital. I think some of you may be very familiar. A lot of human resource departments around the globe rename themselves as human capital department, all right, or human capital management, that change. And then you can see a third shift, which is social capital, all right, where people found that the relationships and the networks that we have in organizations can determine how successful you are. And now we're in the fourth space that you can see, which is called psychological capital. All right, so here you can see, which is basically who you are, your ability to be confident, to have hope, being optimistic, and being resilient. Now, why am I sharing this with you? Because as you can see, that the research is suggesting that there is a big shift in the way we look at competitive advantage, which means that sometimes we need to shift from the traditional economic capital model to also include the psychological capital, which is in every employee in an organization. So when we look at organizational well-being, we are starting with everyone in an organization. Now, can we enhance their psychological capital? To be very honest, me and my colleagues here, we believe that mindfulness can be also a great psychological capital. Now, if we know how to use it. Now, that's a big challenge, all right? So we'll talk a little more about that. So when we bring mindfulness and organizational well-being together, there is a very interesting term that me and my colleagues use, which is, we call it a well-being centered organizational well-being. Now, what is a well-being centered, right? You can see the double, the occurrence of the words in double here. So what do we mean? So we are saying that the organizational well-being, which includes profitability, staff wellness, etc., should also be well-being centered. So your profits, your performance should not be apart from the well-being that you value. All right, so that's exactly what we are talking about. So we're talking about the holistic system of how successful or effective an organization is, should be also rooted on well-being in that sense. Now, how do we then get there? All right, let us look at that. So we use the 4 Ps to bring across this idea of what we mean by well-being centered, all right, performance or organizational well-being. So here you can see that these are the 4 Ps that we talk about in a mindfulness perspective. Now, obviously, right on top is profit, because every business or organization, if it is a profit, if it is not a non-profit organization, generally it's driven for the purpose of profits, all right? Now, that is perhaps one of the sole goals of an organization or a business. Now, then we also want to ensure that the people are also in the center. That means the well-being of the people should also be part of the goal of an organization. And on the left, the planet. Now, when I talk about planet, today we can use the word sustainability. All right, a lot of large corporations are also looking at sustainability initiatives so that we can make sure that the planet, people in the planet are not deprived of the resources that we are using right now. So that refers to planet. And right at the bottom is the person, which is very interesting. You can see people and then the person. Now, the person is what we mean by being well-being centered, because if you see there is a connection among the 4. Now, this is how we see the connection. So right at the heart of every organization, the person is right in the center. And that is why mental health is very important. It's a very important discourse, a very important discussion. And also, you can see that the person right in the center, which is you. So I deliberately use this word. It is about you, because you are the one who is listening right now. You are the one who is taking care of your well-being. So if your well-being is taken care of, in the sense that you take care of your well-being, then the organizational well-being is taken care of. That's what we are saying. So the organizational goals that you're looking at actually depends on the personal well-being of every person. Now, that's what we mean by the well-being centered performance, or well-being centered organizational performance or well-being. All right, that's how we look at it. So the question now is, why is this very important? Now, you may be thinking, why is it that we need to do this? Why can't I conduct yoga programs or maybe other fitness programs in my organization, and that's good enough? But to be very honest, if you looked at the models earlier, that is not good enough, because wellness is quite different from well-being. Now, it's a very important thing, right, that we saw, because well-being involves confidence, resilience, meaning, and purpose, as you can see. So it's far bigger than actually wellness. So therefore, we need to recognize that when we impact the well-being of a person, it has a significant impact on everything else in an organization. We need to recognize that. Now, why is this important right now? Very simple. We are in a VUCA world. Some of you may have heard of this, this particular acronym. Now, VUCA means that we are in a world where things are very volatile, very uncertain, complex, and ambiguous. Now, I don't have to talk more about this because we are living in such times right now where the COVID-19 challenge is not, it's still unmitigated in that sense in certain parts of the world. Of course, in certain parts of the world, we are perhaps doing better, but it's still, yeah, it is something that we are still grappling with, hoping for a virus. So this COVID-19 situation tells us indeed that we are in a VUCA world. So what does this do to us? Now, whenever people in organizations are subject to volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity, you know what happens? We move into something called the doing mode. So in mindfulness, we spend a lot of time, not a lot of time, but rather we emphasize the default mode to be most often the doing mode. So the doing mode is a reactive mode. Now, whenever we are subjected to such situations, we tend to go through these things: worry, fear, stress, repetition, meaning that we repeat the same thing again and again, expecting different results. We go into a mode of reactivity where we keep reacting instead of responding. Sometimes we don't know what to do. Now, I've encountered people who sit at their desk and they just don't know what to do next. Now, such behaviors are possible, and people can be very unhappy while in their organizations, and anxiety. I think at least at this point in time, anxiety is a big issue because there could be job losses, there could be worry about the future, and that could lead people to severe anxiety. So the mental health has become a big challenge in organizations during times like this right now. So what does mindfulness tell us in terms of organizational well-being pertaining to staff well-being? Now, what do we see? Now, here is a list of evidence that we have found. Now, we found that with leaders and mindfulness, we found that leaders perform better, as you can see here, right? So leadership gets impacted, which is a very significant thing because a lot of organizational well-being and organizational performance theories do tell us that leadership has a strong correlation with positive organizational performance, right? So here you can see that there are lots of benefits that leaders can enjoy. Here's another set of research that you can see here. So these are for leaders, and how about for staff, you may ask. Now, what are the benefits at workplace for staff? So you can see here, it decreases stress, creates a healthy learning environment. I like to invite you to look at point 3, which is to enhance innovation and creativity. Even in times like this, we can still do that, all right? And then you can see the rest of it. And there is also one more I'm going to share with you, or there are 2 more set of research. Now here it says, again, employee stress improves hypo development, enhances engagement and reducing burnout. And here is the last one is very, I think, relevant right now. It helps employees cope with organizational change that is possible. I guess change is a constant anyways, right? The last one is this one. Now, this is something that I love talking about because now one of the things that I've noticed is procrastination that people go through at workplaces, right? We tend to procrastinate. No, I'm going to do this task today, but it's going to be then, when today comes, it'll be tomorrow. And the other one is the complaining behavior, pet peeves. All right. So people also find this very challenging. Now, could be this negative bias that we already have in our brains, and it gets more pronounced when we go through challenges in workplaces. So again, mindfulness evidence tells us that when mindfulness training is there, people tend to reduce their complaining behavior in that sense. So these are basically what mindfulness has done in workplaces and in organizational contexts. So as you can see, all the evidences that I shared, they're not talking about wellness alone. I hope you recognize that. We're not talking about wellness alone. We're talking about a space it's about performance from a space of personal well-being. All right. It is not personal well-being without performance, but both, because both are important in organizations, because we are there for a reason. We are there with a purpose. So then the question now is, compared to the current reality what is it that we can possibly do? What can we change in the way that we look at organizational well-being or even wellness in organizations? How can we drive this change? So I'm going to talk about what are the possibilities and potential that you may have in your organizations. All right, so I would like you to look at that right now. Now, the first thing is, whenever, in my experience, we and my colleagues, when we work with organizations in this across the globe and in this region, we notice something. Now, most of the initiatives or interventions that organizations introduce in their space are usually cognitive strategies. When I use the word cognitive, it means training, reflection, coaching, change management initiatives, and all of them are very highly cognitive, very process driven, very structural. And most of the time when I work with organizations, when they talk about wanting to change behavior, the first thing that comes to their mind is training, all right, or putting their teammates in a room and let's train them. Obviously, it's very important. Training is very important as well, because that's one of the ways that we can transform. Or another thing that happens less in I guess medium-sized and small organizations is what I call as behavioral initiatives. Now, when I say behavioral initiatives, like for example, you want to create a coaching culture in your organization. Now, that is also part of a cognitive strategy. All right, just so that you know. All right, I'm talking about the various types of cognitive strategies. But what organizations don't invest in is metacognitive strategies. Now, some of you may not be familiar with the word metacognition or metacognitive strategies. So what is metacognition? Now, metacognition is actually a word that is used in psychology to indicate the thinking behind thinking. That means, let me give an example. All right, so I am angry is quite different from saying I am aware that I am angry. Can you see the distance between anger and myself in the second statement? So I am aware that I am angry is quite different from I am angry, which is completely a direct association with me and the anger, or what I call as identification. So metacognitive strategies are very unique because it allows us to go into the heart of the meta, to look at intentions, to look at purpose, to go a little deeper, to notice the reason behind the behavior. And it's not intrusive, it is not invasive in that sense. So metacognitive strategies have been introduced in some educational systems in some parts of the globe. But metacognitive strategies are pretty hard to grapple with because they are not as tangible as cognitive strategies. Because cognitive strategies are very process-driven, very highly structural, and it's easier for you to make to understand and actually roll it out. While metacognitive strategies requires perhaps a different set of skills. And it's not that it is impossible, it is something that we can learn, right? It's possible. So why I'm talking about this is because a lot of behavioral changes are seated on things that we don't know explicitly, all right? It is right in our minds, but we just don't see it. So metacognitive strategies help us to see these deeper feelings, intentions, and the whys of things, all right, WHY, all right? So that's what happens with metacognitive strategies. So one of the things that organizations that could think about, like all of you perhaps, is to drive change by balancing these two strategies. Now, it is not to be displaced in that sense. So what I'm proposing is that the cognitive strategies should stay, it should still continue, but we need to also empower the possibility of staffs being able to get to the space of metacognition, which is an important skill. So that is what I'm talking about earlier with all of those mindfulness evidence that I shared, because mindfulness impacts the human mind from a metacognitive perspective. Now that's what happens. So the question then some of you may be having at this point is whether mindfulness is the only way to impact metacognition. Now the answer is no. There are several other ways that we can impact metacognition or enhance metacognition. And some cognitive strategies can also help you to enhance metacognition. But the only difference here is that in mindfulness, we do not adopt a very strong cognitive process to get there. That's the difference. That means in mindfulness training, we teach people by training their brain in that sense, instead of trying to train their thinking. Because trying to change a habit or change someone's thinking is more difficult than training the brain. So that's why we have seen across the globe successes in addiction treatment. Now, some of you may be very familiar with, Alcoholic Anonymous, as your AA, as they call it. People come together and then they treat people with alcoholic addiction. Now, mindfulness approach to any kind of addiction has shown quite very interesting results, because addiction is a very good people with addictive behaviors rather are generally a very good population to study the effect of mindfulness, because addiction is a habit that is not easy to give up. So we found that mindfulness has a very strong impact on people with addictive behaviors, which then tell us that mindfulness works at a level where it is metacognitive and it can change behavior without being abrasive or invasive, like how cognitive strategies are. So there is a place for cognitive strategies, and there is a place for metacognitive strategies right now, because we have more evidence to suggest that we can actually take advantage of training like mindfulness to actually empower and enable the possibility of metacognition, of being aware of what we are going through, thoughts, feelings, sensations, emotions, etc., in everyone or in an organization, so that they are aligned with what we want to achieve, and they are also taking care of themselves as they perform well in their jobs. So this is basically the thrust of what I wanted to share today. I would like to end my discussion, or my sharing rather, to make a statement that mental health initiatives now can be embodied into organizational culture and not be a pulse intervention. Now, when I use the word pulse intervention, many a time people tend to think that mental health initiatives should be a pulse. Now, let's start a yoga class. Let's start a fitness class. Now, that's all good. It's great that we are doing that. But rather than that, we can allow the insights that we have gained from what we see from mindfulness, to see whether, when as an organization, we get into the metacognitive space, and whether that could actually impact organizational culture in a great way. All right, so that's exactly what I wanted to, that's my parting statement at this point in time. So just so that if you would like to ask more questions about what I've shared, or you have any thoughts, reflections, comments, or even if you feel that you disagree with what I've shared, now please feel free to share with me. You can see this is my email address and also my LinkedIn QR code that leads me to my LinkedIn account, and you can connect with me there and ask more questions. So I'm going to take a break right now to answer questions that you may have. All right, so if you have any questions, now please write that out in the Q&A chat window that you can see in the room right now. Now click on Q&A, and then you can type your questions, and I will respond to those questions if I have the answers to it. Okay, so all right, so question from here, one question that has come up is, what are some of the metacognitive approaches that organizations can take to imbibe a culture of mental well-being? So there are many ways to do it, but we need to get into the heart of the meta by actually allowing leaders to have a well-being perspective when working with their teammates. That's number one. That is it's also a cognitive strategy, but it allows to get into the metacognitive space. So we talk about how managers and leaders can be more of coaches rather than just being leaders and managers. We're not managing by objectives. We're not managing by goals, but looking at the person's well-being as you work and lead teams and perhaps your direct reports and teammates. That's number one. Now, number two is obvious, is mindfulness training. Now, you could make mindfulness training as one of your, what I call as initiative in your organizations over a period of time. Just so that you know, mindfulness training is not very effective when it's just like a one-day intervention. Usually mindfulness training is conducted over a length of time because it takes some time for the human mind to adjust to new strategies. And typically it takes about 5 to 8 weeks of intervention. Once a week, usually it is done, so that the staffs can actually train themselves over a period of time before they see change. All right, so these are some of the ways. There are more ways, but I'm just responding in the interest of time very briefly. All right, next question. Right, do you have any tips on how to create sustainable organizational culture that based on mental well-being? Yes, I shared with you 2 of them. One of them is, in fact, we use a third one as well, which I'll share with you in a while. The first one is the model that I shared earlier, which is called Positive Organizational Scholarship, which is one of the models that can help. The other one is, of course, Positive Psychological Capital. That's one. And the third one that we have been using very much is another model that we use, which is called Integrated Wellbeing Model. All right, which is something that is new, and we have been using that because we look at all aspects of an organization and see how you can actually impact at each of the level. Now, when I say level, it's very interesting. So we start by looking at the space of an organization, the typical workplace. How do you look at that? Now, look at that. Is it positive? Is it what I call as enhancing well-being in that sense? Now, next, the activity of the staff or the employees in the organization. Now, how do the activities that are promoted in the work life, in the work life behavior, or the workplace behavior rather, does it promote, does it enhance energy, or does it deplete energy? That's one way, and so forth. Emotional well-being, and then intellectual well-being, which is basically how autonomous staff are, how empowered they are, do they know what they need to do when they have a question, and lastly, purpose and meaning. Now, you saw that in the Positive Organizational Scholarship as well. Now, meaning is a very important sense-making process that is important for employees and organizations. Now, from a mindfulness perspective, we go through these processes in the mindfulness training as well. So in mindfulness training in organizations, staff look at what is meaningful to them at their workplace. Or if I'm working with ABC, a large corporation perhaps, now what is it that connects me to the purpose of that organization? Now, holding on to that meaning and bring that meaning into my awareness and making that intentional can have a significant impact in terms of realizing it through purely intention. That's one of the models in mindfulness as well. We call this the intention, attitude, and attention model. There's another model in mindfulness, which tells us that when people practice mindfulness with a very clear intention, they are more effective in achieving their goals. So that's how you get there. I hope I've answered the question as well. Thanks for the great questions. Any other questions that you may have? Okay, I can see more. What are some meta-cognitive strategies which you have seen that have been successfully implemented in organizations? So I think I've responded to that question. Like, for example, we have General Mills and Google that actually use mindfulness and emotional intelligence as well to actually enhance metacognition. All right, so that's the key point. Now, the problem here perhaps is, I want to be very clear here. Now, one of the reasons why we are very curious about metacognition is because we may be also looking at metacognitive strategies like the way we look at cognitive strategies. So we are looking for a very explicit process in terms of trying to get there. But what I'm saying is that the way to get there is through a very, very intentional and a self-focused training. That means it's not just another cognitive strategy to get there, although there are some, as I already shared, but it's more devoted to the self, enhancing the self, working on the self in that sense. All right, so it's good to be aware of that as well, because we are using our cognitive processes to try to see how to get there, when the training is actually centered on the self, training the mind, training the brain to get there, so to say. But thanks for the great question. Next, right, may I know how often we should practice mindfulness in a company? Now, there are many ways that you can do it. Now, one of the best ways to do this is to make mindfulness a little informal. Now, what do I mean by informal? Now, for example, I suggest simple ideas like, before you start a meeting in a room, or before you start a Zoom meeting, could you practice mindfulness for 3 minutes? All right, so how often? Now, if you could do 3 to 5 minutes once a day, that's great in a company. So if we could do that as a team, there is also a kind of what I call as a common humanity. All right, now common humanity is actually a term that we use in mindfulness to show that we are all in the same space, going through the same difficulties and sharing the same successes. So coming from that space, it is great when we can practice mindfulness together as a team. Now that can be very great in that sense, because it helps people to connect with each other as they practice mindfulness. So that is one additional element that I would like to add. So if we could do just 3 to 5 minutes a day, every day in your company, and if you can do it as a team before meetings, that is also a connection. Relationships get enhanced. All right. So thanks for the question. I see another question. How do you feel that scale impacts an organization's ability to commit and deliver organization? Okay, very good. I believe this, what I call, to what scale, to what extent. Now, this is, there are many factors that contribute to how you can implement, all right, an organization's ability, that deals with bandwidth, that deals with your priorities, that deals with also finances. So it's the best thing to do is to go through a very consultative process to see what are your priorities and how you think such a culture, or what are the levers, I use the word levers, what are the levers that we can focus on to create the attributes of the organizational well-being that you're talking about. So that is one way that you can do that. All right, so a couple of things: finances, bandwidth, priorities, and what's urgent, what's important. Looking at all of that, you can then do that. All right, thanks for the question. Right, next question: do you think that this training is suitable for Gen Y and Gen Z in dynamic culture? I would say yes, because we have trained thousands of people perhaps in this generation group. So definitely it's possible, because the reason being that this is the way that mindfulness training is conducted. It is not didactic. It is not a lecture. It is very much centered on practice and what we call as conversations, or in mindfulness term, we call this inquiry. All right, we inquire into the experience, and Gen Y, Gen Z, where relational dynamics, or which is very important in the group here, where they could be possibly more expressive, perhaps. I'm generalizing, pardon me, but possibly expressive. So training like this helps them to discover and talk more about their deeper feelings. Now, Gen Y, Gen Z, again, if I were to generalize a little more, with technology, now it also tells us that we also can possibly bring mindfulness through technology, through apps and stuff like that, so that it becomes more palatable for such an audience. So we need to think about that as well. And we have done that. And in my experience, we have been relatively, I would say, very successful, not even relatively successful, because people get to talk and get to think and talk about their inner feelings and intentions, etc. Next question: as you know, the different people have different culture. It's hard to persuade to have coordination sometimes. In that case, do you think if mindfulness can help? Definitely. Now, why? So there is a very important component in mindfulness where we look at each other from the perspective of common humanity, which I just mentioned. Now, that means that I look at another person not as a personality, but as a human being. Now, the moment I start looking at myself as a human being and then recognizing that everyone else is a very simple human being, now we touch a different space. Now we start to again, evidence shows that people become more empathetic, people become more compassionate. So when compassion and empathy enter in a workspace, now imagine the potential it has. It creates, it promotes stronger relationships. It helps people to understand each other. There could be perhaps fewer conflicts. And therefore, I would say that the coordination perhaps becomes easier, all right, in that sense. So that's how I look at it. Not that I'm saying it will work all the time, but what I'm sharing with you is there is a great potential from the perspective of evidence and practice, practice as well as evidence in that sense, to look at it from this, take this perspective that I just shared. And this is the last question that I'm going to respond. There are so many mindfulness practices as on digital apps. Which one do you recommend for organization? They serve different purposes at different times. Now, the app, I'm not gonna talk about a particular app. The app that you choose has to be what I call as culturally relevant. That's number one. Now, because there are many mindfulness apps that have religious or a spiritual undercurrent. There are apps like that. Now, so when you need to look for an app that is culturally sensitive in that sense. Now, especially if you look at, so where I live in Singapore, now it's a multicultural society, as everyone would know. The what I call as the society is built on the premise of cohesion and what I call cultural harmony in that sense. So when we have a society or a community or organization that promotes diversity and not wanting to impose in any way, consciously or unconsciously, on any kind of spiritual ideals, then we have to be very careful on the type of apps that we use. Because in our experience, there are certain apps that could be very neutral and very secular in that sense. And there are apps that could have those undertones and undercurrent in that sense. It tends to exude that without, perhaps that people don't even know that. And that is a possibility, because sometimes app developers do not take this into consideration, because all they're looking at is how I can bring mindfulness out without taking this into consideration. So I would say that, yes, that's one of the criterion that you could use. And I think the second question, do they serve different purposes at different times? Now, that is not the case, because most mindfulness apps are, again, most authentic mindfulness apps, because there are many apps that may claim that they teach mindfulness, but they are not evidence-based mindfulness. Number one, they may not be secular mindfulness. They may be calling it a mindfulness app, but actually they're teaching meditation. There's even apps that tries to reprogram your brain subconsciously. Now, such apps are not mindfulness at all, because in mindfulness practices, we don't want to get to the space. That's not mindfulness, to try to reprogram your brain or your mind at a subconscious level. That is certainly not mindfulness. But apps claim that they are mindfulness apps, but actually they are not. So it's very good to be mindful and respecting the fact that I'm in a public space. And if you would like very targeted, if you have a targeted question about an app or something like that, now feel free to reach out to me, and I'll be very happy to guide you as to what are the possibilities that you may have and what kind of apps you can possibly use given the culture that you are in. All right, so now with that, I believe I have answered all the questions, and thanks for the great questions. And I hope this session was valuable to every one of you. Before I check out, now, if there's anything else to share from my end, is nothing but gratitude. And I'm grateful to be given this opportunity to speak with all of you. And I wish that you are well, and I wish that you are happy, and your well-being continues to be great in these very difficult times. All right. Thank you, my friends. Now, before I check out, let me share my contact details one more time. In case you have a question, you can choose to write to me, and I would respond you either via email or via LinkedIn. Thank you very much, and have a great rest of the day. Bye-bye.